The silence of the noose hung over Terlingua, Texas, that fateful morning in 1885. But Zara Wilson refused to bow her head even as the town council sentenced her to public humiliation for daring to challenge their decision to divert the creek water from the smaller farms. 3 days in the stocks for causing public disorder and speaking against the elected officials of this town, Mayor Hollister pronounced, his gavel striking with finality that echoed through the small courthouse. Zara's hands clenched at her sides, her 22-year-old frame trembling not with fear but with fury. The small farms will wither and die without that water, while Hollister Ranch gets more than its share. That's not justice, that's theft. Her voice rang clear in the packed room. The spectators gasped. Women did not speak so boldly in Terlingua, especially not orphan seamstresses who lived alone in tiny adobe homes at the edge of town. "Make that 5 days," the mayor amended, his jowls quivering with anger. "And perhaps that will teach you that a woman's place is not in matters of town governance." The bailiff dragged her away, her boots scraping against the wooden floor as she continued to protest. "The people deserve to know the truth. Your brother-in-law stands to profit from this water diversion. This town deserves better than corrupt officials lining their own pockets." "Gag her," the mayor ordered, and a dirty rag was shoved between her teeth. By noon, Zara found herself locked in the wooden stocks in the town square, her neck and wrists confined uncomfortably between rough-hewn boards. A sign hung above her, punished for seditious speech against town officials. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on her exposed head. They had taken her bonnet, a deliberate cruelty in the Texas heat. Her throat burned with thirst, but the water ladle remained just out of reach, another calculated humiliation. Children threw pebbles while their mothers whispered behind gloved hands. The men either leered or looked away in discomfort. None offered help. None dared oppose the mayor and his powerful allies. By the second day, Zara's lips had cracked from dehydration, and her vision swam. Still, whenever someone approached close enough, she would try to speak through parched lips about the injustice of the water rights decision. Most hurried away, unwilling to be associated with the troublemaker. The afternoon of the third day brought a dust cloud on the horizon. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, the townspeople could make out a tall figure atop a muscular black stallion. His arrival caused a stir. Strangers were always of interest in small towns like Terlingua, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The rider dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but his broad shoulders and confident stride commanded attention. Dust from the trail coated his leather vest and denims, and spurs clinked softly with each step. He paused at the sight of Zara in the stocks, tipping his hat back to reveal striking blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. Without a word, he approached, ignoring the nervous glances of onlookers. Kneeling before her, he lifted a canteen to her lips. "Drink," he said, his voice low and rough like desert sand. She swallowed gratefully, the water the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. "What's your crime?" he asked, studying the sign above her head. Zara's voice was barely a whisper after days of exposure. "I spoke the truth about corruption." "Louder," he urged. "I want to hear your voice." She cleared her throat and repeated herself with more strength. A slow smile spread across his face. "Your voice," he said, "is what I've been searching for." Before she could question his strange statement, he stood and strode purposefully toward the sheriff's office. The stranger returned minutes later with the sheriff following reluctantly behind him. Without ceremony, he produced a document from his saddlebag and handed it to the lawman. "This woman is free to go," the sheriff announced, looking uncomfortable. "By order of the territorial judge." The crowd murmured in surprise as the sheriff unlocked the stocks. Zara stumbled forward, her limbs numb and uncooperative after days of confinement. The stranger caught her effortlessly. "Blake Lawson," he introduced himself, steadying her. "Special investigator for Judge Harmon." "Zara Wilson," she replied, her voice still raspy. "I know who you are, Miss Wilson. I've been tracking reports of corruption in water rights across 3 counties. Your name came up as someone who might know something." He glanced around at the curious onlookers. "But this isn't the place to talk. Can you ride?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure her legs would support her. Blake helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. As they rode away from the town square, whispers followed them like wind through prairie grass. "Where are we going?" she asked, acutely aware of his arm around her waist, steadying her on the saddle. "Somewhere safe, where you can recover and tell me everything you know about Mayor Hollister and his water rights scheme." They rode to a small homestead just outside town that Blake had arranged to use during his investigation. The modest cabin belonged to a rancher currently driving cattle to market, leaving Blake to watch over the property in his absence. Inside, Blake helped Zara to a chair and busied himself preparing a simple meal while she told him everything: how the mayor had manipulated the town council, how the water diversion would benefit his relatives' properties while leaving smaller farms to wither, how she had discovered documents proving the corruption when mending the mayor's wife's dress. "I found the plans in his coat pocket," she explained. "I couldn't stay silent." Blake nodded thoughtfully, setting a plate of beans and cornbread before her. "Your courage is admirable, but it nearly got you killed. Dehydration is no small matter in this heat." "What choice did I have?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "My parents didn't raise me to be silent in the face of injustice before the fever took them." Blake studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't suppose they did." He smiled slightly. "Eat now. Tomorrow we have work to do." For the next several days, Zara recovered her strength while helping Blake compile evidence against Mayor Hollister and his conspirators. They worked side by side, reviewing documents, making notes, and questioning sympathetic townspeople who came secretly to the cabin. Blake proved to be unlike any man Zara had ever known. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and treated her as an equal partner in the investigation. He was educated and well-spoken, yet comfortable with the rugged demands of frontier life. His hands could wield a pen with the same precision as his Colt revolver. Each evening, they would sit on the porch as the sun set over the distant mountains, talking long into the night. Blake told her of his childhood in Boston, his education in law, and his decision to come west, where he felt he could make a real difference. "My father wanted me to join his law practice," he explained one evening. "Handling the affairs of wealthy clients, navigating society, marrying some proper Boston lady with the right connections." "Why didn't you?" Zara asked, watching the play of emotions across his face. "I read about the corruption out west, how powerful men were stealing land and resources from those who couldn't defend themselves." He paused. "I couldn't sit in a comfortable office knowing I could be doing something that mattered." Zara nodded. "I understand. After my parents died, I could have gone to live with my aunt in Philadelphia. She offered to introduce me to suitable gentlemen and help me find a respectable husband." She smiled wryly. "But I stayed in Terlingua. This is my home and these are my people. If I don't stand up for them, who will?" Blake's eyes reflected the dying sunlight. "That's why your voice caught my attention, Zara. In a world where most people just accept injustice, you refuse to be silent." Something shifted between them that evening, a recognition of kindred spirits that transcended their different backgrounds. The following week brought developments in their investigation. Through careful work and discreet questioning, they discovered that Mayor Hollister was merely a puppet. The real power behind the water rights scheme was Theodore Blackwell, owner of the Territorial Bank and several large ranches. Blackwell's planning to buy up the small farms once they fail without water, Blake explained, spreading a map across the table. Then he'll have a monopoly on all the fertile land between here and the river. We need to present this to the territorial judge, Zara insisted. Before it's too late for the farmers, Blake hesitated. It's not that simple. Blackwell has influence with some of the judges. We need to make sure our evidence reaches Judge Harmon specifically. Then let's go find him, Zara said, already gathering their documents. Blake caught her hand. It's dangerous, Zara. Blackwell has hired guns, men who wouldn't hesitate to silence us permanently. She met his gaze steadily. I'm not afraid. The touch of his hand on hers lingered, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Blake cleared his throat and released her hand. We'll leave at dawn, he decided. Judge Harmon is due in El Paso next week. We can intercept him there. They prepared for the journey, gathering supplies and copying their evidence in case one set of documents was lost or destroyed. The night before their departure, a storm rolled in from the west, bringing with it sheets of rain and booming thunder. Zara stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. Blake moved to stand beside her. I've been thinking, he said quietly. After this is over, after we've presented our evidence. Yes, Zara prompted when he fell silent. I've accepted a position with the Federal Marshal's office in Santa Fe. They need investigators who understand the complexities of water rights and land claims. Zara felt a sudden hollowness in her chest. That's wonderful. You'll do important work there. I was wondering if you might consider coming with me. The words tumbled out in a rush. Your knowledge of these matters, your courage, your unwavering sense of justice, these qualities are rare, Zara. We make a good team. She turned to face him, surprised by the offer and uncertain of its full meaning. As your assistant, Blake ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically flustered. As my partner, in all things if you were so inclined. His eyes met hers. I know we've known each other only briefly, but I feel as though I've been waiting to hear your voice my entire life. Before Zara could respond, a thunderous knocking at the door interrupted them. Blake motioned for her to stay back as he approached the door cautiously, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Who's there? He called. Samuel Porter, sir, from the Wilson farm down the road. The voice was young and frightened. Blake opened the door to reveal a soaking wet boy of about 15. Mr. Lawson, Miss Wilson Blackwell's men are coming. My pa sent me to warn you. They're saying you two are wanted for theft of private documents and conspiracy against the town council. Zara exchanged an alarmed glance with Blake. How many men, Samuel? At least 6 riders, maybe more. They were gathering at the saloon when Pa heard them talking. Blake made a swift decision. Thank your father for the warning. Now get home before you're seen with us. He pressed a coin into the boy's hand. Not a word about where you've been. After Samuel disappeared into the stormy night, Blake turned to Zara. We need to leave now. They'll be watching the roads to El Paso. The old mining trails, Zara suggested immediately. They lead through the mountains. Few people know them now that the Silvers played out. Blake nodded. Can you guide us? My father was a mine engineer before he turned to farming. He showed me those trails. She was already gathering their essential belongings. Within minutes, they had packed their evidence, some food and basic supplies. Blake doused the lamps and fire, leaving the cabin dark as they slipped out the back door into the driving rain. They reached the stable and quickly saddled Blake's stallion and a sturdy mare that belonged to the property. Leading the horses quietly away from the cabin, they kept to the shadow of a rocky ridge until they reached the trailhead Zara remembered. The old mining trail was barely visible in the darkness, but Zara led with surprising confidence. They rode single file, the horses picking their way carefully up the increasingly steep path. The rain made the terrain treacherous, but it also covered their tracks and muffled the sound of their passage. After an hour of difficult climbing, they paused in the shelter of an overhanging rock to catch their breath and listen for pursuers. "You think they'll follow us in this weather?" Zara asked, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Blackwell's men are being paid well, I imagine," Blake replied grimly, "and they'll know we have evidence that could ruin their employer." He helped her down from her horse. "Let's rest here until the storm passes. The horses need it." They huddled together under the rocky overhang, sharing a blanket for warmth as the storm continued to rage. Despite the danger, Zara found herself acutely aware of Blake's proximity, of his arm around her shoulders and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You never answered my question," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain. Zara looked up at him, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes. "About Santa Fe, about being my partner." She hesitated, searching his face in the darkness. "I hardly know you, Blake Lawson." "You know what matters," he replied. "You know I believe in justice as fiercely as you do. You know I respect your mind and your courage." His hand found hers beneath the blanket. "And I think you know how I feel when I look at you." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I've never met a man who didn't try to silence me before," she admitted. "My own fiancé broke our engagement because I spoke at a town meeting." "Then he was a fool," Blake said simply. "Your voice is your greatest strength, Zara. It's what drew me to you." She was about to respond when the distant sound of voices carried through the rain. Blake immediately tensed, his hand moving to his revolver. "They're following the trail," he whispered. "We need to move." They mounted quickly and continued higher into the mountains, the path growing narrower and more dangerous. Zara led them through a maze of switchbacks and false trails until they reached an abandoned mine entrance just as the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. "We can hide here," she suggested. "The mine has multiple levels and exits. My father helped design it." The entrance was partially collapsed but still passable. They led the horses inside where it was dry if not warm. Blake produced a small lantern from his saddlebag and lit it, revealing a tunnel that extended deep into the mountain. "We should rest while we can," he said, tethering the horses near the entrance where they could still get fresh air. "I'll take first watch." Zara nodded, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She settled against a relatively smooth section of wall, wrapping herself in the damp blanket. Despite her intention to stay alert, she quickly drifted into an uneasy sleep. She awoke with a start some hours later to Blake's hand gently shaking her shoulder. "They're searching the area," he whispered. "I can hear them calling to each other outside." Zara listened intently. Sure enough, muffled voices echoed from somewhere outside the mine. "They're too close to the main entrance," she whispered back. "We need to go deeper and find another way out." Gathering their belongings quickly, they led the nervous horses further into the mine. The tunnel descended at a gentle slope, branching occasionally into smaller passages. Zara navigated confidently, relying on her father's descriptions and the occasional marking on the rock walls. "Here," she said eventually, pointing to a narrow passage. "This should lead to a secondary entrance on the other side of the ridge." The passage was tight, forcing them to proceed single file, leading the horses carefully. The air grew staler as they ventured deeper, and Blake's lantern cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a lonely percussion accompanying their cautious footsteps. After what felt like hours of tense silence, they began to see a faint glow ahead, natural light filtering through another entrance. Relief washed over them as they emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a different valley than the one they had left. "We should be able to circle back toward El Paso from here," Zara said, orienting herself by the position of the sun. "It will add a day to our journey, but we'll avoid Blackwell's men." Blake nodded, impressed by her knowledge of the terrain. "You continue to amaze me, Zara Wilson." They made camp that night in a secluded grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream. With no sign of pursuit, they risked a small fire to dry their clothes and warm some coffee. Sitting side by side, they reviewed their plan to reach Judge Harmon. "Once we present our evidence, what happens next?" Zara asked, staring into the flames. "The judge will issue warrants for Blackwell and his conspirators," Blake explained. "The water rights decision will be overturned. The farms will be safe. And then you go to Santa Fe," she said quietly. Blake turned to face her, the firelight illuminating his features. "That depends on you." Zara met his gaze. "I've spent my whole life in Terlingua. It's all I know." "Is it all you want to know?" he challenged gently. The question hung between them, filled with possibilities neither had dared to voice fully. "I want," Zara began, then stopped, gathering her courage. "I want a life where my voice matters, where I can fight for what's right without being punished for it." "That's what I'm offering," Blake said, taking her hand. "A partnership of equals, your voice alongside mine, making a difference across the territory." "And what of personal matters?" she asked hesitantly. Blake's expression softened. "I'm offering my heart as well, Zara, if you'll have it." The directness of his words took her breath away. In her world, men rarely spoke so openly of feelings, especially to women they considered beneath them socially. Yet here was Blake Lawson, educated and respected, offering her not just professional respect but personal devotion as well. Before she could respond, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond their fire. Blake was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the flames with a swift kick of dirt. They stood back to back, straining to hear any further sounds of approach. "Could be an animal," Zara whispered. "Could be," Blake agreed, though his hand remained on his revolver. They waited in tense silence until Blake finally relaxed slightly. "We should move on anyway. We've rested enough." They traveled through the night, using the stars for navigation. By morning, they had put significant distance between themselves and any potential pursuers. They stopped briefly to rest the horses at a small waterhole, taking the opportunity to refill their canteens and wash the dust from their faces. Zara caught Blake watching her as she combed her fingers through her tangled hair. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking how remarkable you are," he replied. "Most women of my acquaintance would be complaining bitterly about now no proper bed, no change of clothes, riding through the night." She laughed softly. "Most women of your acquaintance probably weren't orphaned at 16 and left to fend for themselves." "True enough," he acknowledged. "But hardship either breaks people or reveals their true strength. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Zara Wilson." His sincerity warmed her more than the morning sun. "We should reach El Paso by tomorrow if we maintain this pace," she said, changing the subject before her emotions betrayed her. They continued their journey, making good time across the rugged landscape. As they rode, Blake told her more about his vision for their work in Santa Fe, investigating land fraud, protecting water rights for small farmers, ensuring that the powerful didn't simply rewrite the law to suit themselves. "The frontier is changing," he explained. "More people arriving every day, more money to be made. Without honest enforcement of the law, the same corruption we've seen in the East will take root here." "And two people can make a difference?" Zara asked, not skeptically but hopefully. "Two people like us." "Absolutely." His confidence was infectious. "Judge Harmon has been building a network of honest agents throughout the territory. We wouldn't be alone in the fight." As they made camp that evening within a day's ride of El Paso, Zara found herself increasingly drawn to Blake's vision of their future and to Blake himself. His integrity, his respect for her mind and voice, his unwavering commitment to justice, these qualities called to something deep within her. They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, sitting closer than strictly necessary. When Blake's hand brushed hers as he passed her a cup of coffee, neither pulled away immediately. "I've been thinking about your offer," Zara said finally, gathering her courage. Blake's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed his interest. "And I have conditions," she stated firmly. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I would expect nothing less. I want to be a true partner, not just an assistant. Equal say in our investigations, equal credit for our work." Blake nodded. "Agreed. What else?" "I want to learn the law, not just practical application, but the theory behind it. I want access to your books, your knowledge." "You'll have it," he promised. "Though I suspect you'll soon surpass my understanding in some areas." Zara took a deep breath before stating her final condition. "And I want us to court properly before making any permanent arrangements. I won't rush into marriage, regardless of how I might feel about you." Blake's smile broadened. "And how do you feel about me, Zara Wilson?" She met his gaze steadily. "I feel that you could be the person I've been waiting for my entire life, someone who values my voice rather than trying to silence it." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I accept your conditions, all of them, though I hope the courting period won't be excessively long." A flush crept up Zara's cheeks at his touch. "We'll see how well you court, Blake Lawson." Their moment of connection was interrupted by the distant sound of horses, multiple riders approaching from the direction they had come. Blake was on his feet instantly, helping Zara up. "Mount up," he urged. "They must have followed our trail after all." They rode hard into the gathering darkness, pushing their tired horses to greater speed. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them, accompanied now by occasional shouts. "There's an arroyo ahead," Zara called to Blake. "If we can reach it, we might lose them in the network of dry creek beds." They galloped toward the depression in the land, sliding their horses down the steep bank into the sandy bottom of the ancient waterway. Following its winding course, they navigated through a maze of interconnected channels, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, but they continued on, unwilling to risk stopping until they were certain of their safety. The moon rose, providing enough light to navigate by, and they pressed on toward El Paso. They reached the outskirts of the city just as dawn was breaking. Exhausted but triumphant, they made their way to the courthouse, where Judge Harmon was scheduled to begin hearing cases that morning. The territorial courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick, a statement of permanence and authority, in a land where most buildings were still constructed of adobe or wood. Blake and Zara tied their horses at the hitching post and climbed the steps, their precious evidence secured in Blake's saddlebag. Inside, they found the courthouse already buzzing with activity. Clerks hurried about with stacks of papers, lawyers conferred in hushed tones with clients, and armed marshals stood at strategic positions throughout the building. Blake approached one of the clerks. "We need to see Judge Harmon immediately." "I'm Blake Lawson," special investigator. This is a matter of urgent importance. The clerk looked skeptical. The judge is preparing for court. He's not seeing anyone without an appointment. Blake produced his credentials. Tell him it concerns Theodore Blackwell and water rights corruption in Terlingua. He'll want to see us. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Wait here. While they waited, Zara became aware of their disheveled appearance, clothes dusty and wrinkled from days on the trail, faces sun-burned and wind-chapped. She attempted to smooth her hair and straighten her jacket, suddenly conscious of how she might be perceived in this formal setting. Blake noticed her discomfort. "You look fine," he assured her quietly. "More than fine." Before she could respond, the clerk returned. "The judge will see you in his chambers. Follow me." They were led down a corridor to a heavy oak door. The clerk knocked once, then opened it to reveal a spacious office dominated by a massive desk covered in law books and documents. Behind it sat Judge Harmon, a lean man in his 60s with penetrating gray eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. "Blake Lawson," the judge greeted, standing to shake Blake's hand. "It's been some time, and this must be Miss Wilson I've heard about." Zara blinked in surprise. "You've heard of me, Your Honor? Indeed. Word travels, especially when a young woman is publicly punished for speaking truth to power." The judge's eyes twinkled. "I was about to send a federal marshal to investigate when I received word that Blake had already intervened." "Please, sit down and tell me what you've discovered." For the next hour, they presented their evidence: the altered water rights documents, witness statements, financial records showing suspicious transactions between Mayor Hollister and Theodore Blackwell, maps of the affected properties. Judge Harmon reviewed everything methodically, asking occasional sharp questions that revealed his quick grasp of the situation. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is precisely the sort of corruption I've been concerned about," he said gravely. "Left unchecked, men like Blackwell would own the entire territory within a decade." "Will you issue the warrants, Your Honor?" Blake asked. "Immediately," the judge confirmed. "I'll also issue an injunction halting the water diversion." He turned to Zara. "Miss Wilson, the territory owes you a debt of gratitude for your courage. Not many would risk what you did to expose this corruption." "I only did what was right," she replied simply. "If only more people shared your conviction," the judge said with a sad smile. He turned back to Blake. "I understand you've accepted the position in Santa Fe." "Yes, Your Honor. I'll be reporting to Marshal Davis next month." "Excellent." The judge's gaze moved between them speculatively. "And will Miss Wilson be joining you in this endeavor?" Blake glanced at Zara, allowing her to answer for herself. "I believe I will, Your Honor," she said with quiet confidence. "Mr. Lawson has offered me a partnership I find uniquely appealing." The judge's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I see. Well, the territory will benefit from having both of you fighting for justice." He stood, indicating the meeting was concluded. "I'll have my clerk prepare the necessary documents. In the meantime, I suggest you both get some rest. You look as though you've had a difficult journey." As they left the courthouse, the weight of their mission finally lifted. Blake led Zara to a respectable hotel where they could clean up and rest while the judge's orders were processed. "We'll need to return to Terlingua once the warrants are served," Blake explained as they stood in the hotel lobby. "To tie up loose ends and collect your belongings." "And to see justice done," Zara added firmly. Blake smiled. "And that. But first, food and rest. We've earned it." After securing separate rooms, Blake was insistent on propriety, despite their days together on the trail. They agreed to meet for dinner, once they had bathed and changed into clean clothes purchased from shops near the hotel. When Zara descended to the hotel dining room that evening, Blake was waiting in the lobby. He stood as she approached, his expression one of undisguised admiration. She had chosen a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, her dark hair freshly washed and styled. "You look beautiful," he said sincerely. "You clean up rather well yourself," she replied, noting how the fresh shirt and vest emphasized his broad shoulders. Dinner was a surprisingly relaxed affair after the tension of recent days. They spoke of lighter matters, books they had read, places they hoped to see, childhood memories untainted by later hardships. For perhaps the first time, they were simply a man and woman enjoying each other's company, the burden of their investigation temporarily set aside. Over dessert, Blake reached across the table to take her hand. "I've been thinking about your conditions," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Oh," Zara raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore the pleasant sensation his touch evoked. "The courting period, I want to do this properly." His blue eyes held hers intently. "When we return to Terlingua, I'd like to call on you formally, take you for rides, perhaps to dinner when possible, court you as you deserve to be courted." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "I'd like that," she admitted. "And I want you to know that regardless of what develops between us personally, our professional partnership stands." He squeezed her hand gently. "Your voice matters, Zara. Your mind, your courage, your unwavering sense of justice, these are what drew me to you first and foremost." "And here I thought it might have been my pretty eyes," she teased. Though she was deeply moved by his words, Blake laughed. "Those didn't hurt your cause," he admitted. "But I fell in love with your voice, with the woman who refused to be silenced even when facing public humiliation." The word love hung between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both keenly aware of its significance. The following morning, they received word that Judge Harmon had dispatched federal marshals to Terlingua with warrants for Mayor Hollister, Theodore Blackwell, and several of their associates. Blake and Zara were asked to follow a day behind, giving the marshals time to make the arrests before they arrived to provide additional testimony. Their return journey to Terlingua was far less eventful than their escape had been. They traveled at an easy pace, no longer pursued, taking time to enjoy the rugged beauty of the landscape and each other's company. Blake proved to be an attentive companion, pointing out interesting flora and fauna, sharing stories of his previous investigations, and always encouraging Zara to share her own observations and insights. In the evenings, as they made camp under star-filled skies, their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Blake spoke of his mother's death when he was 12, how it had shaped his determination to protect the vulnerable. Zara shared the pain of losing both parents to fever, the struggle to maintain their small farm before finally selling it to pay debts and establish herself as a seamstress in town. On their final night before reaching Terlingua, Blake produced a small package from his saddlebag after dinner. "I got this in El Paso," he explained, handing it to Zara. "Consider it the first official gesture of my courtship." Curious, she unwrapped the package to find a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with her initials. "For your thoughts, your observations, your voice," Blake explained. "I thought you might want to document our investigations, perhaps even publish someday if you're inclined." Zara ran her fingers over the smooth leather, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you," she said softly. "No one has ever encouraged me to write down my thoughts before." "Their loss," Blake replied simply. "The world needs your perspective, Zara." She looked up from the journal to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to withdraw if she wished, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Zara responded with a tentative pressure of her own, her hand coming up to rest lightly on his chest. The kiss deepened gradually, neither rushing, both savoring this new dimension of their connection. When they finally parted, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I first heard you speak in the town square," he admitted. "Even with me filthy and half delirious in the stocks," she teased. "Even then," he confirmed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Your courage was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." They arrived in Terlingua the following afternoon to find the town in an uproar. Mayor Hollister, Theodore Blackwell, and 3 town councilmen had been arrested and transported to El Paso for trial. The federal marshals had posted notices throughout town explaining the charges and announcing that the water rights decision had been temporarily suspended pending a fair hearing. As Blake and Zara rode into the town square, people stopped to stare. Word of their involvement in the arrests had clearly spread. Some faces showed gratitude, others resentment, but none could ignore the confidence with which Zara now carried herself, riding beside Blake as an equal. They stopped first at the sheriff's office, where one marshal remained to maintain order. He greeted them warmly. "Judge Harmon sends his regards," the marshal said. "The evidence you provided was rock solid. Blackwell's already offering to testify against the others in exchange for leniency." "Not surprising," Blake commented. "Men like him rarely show loyalty when their own necks are on the line." "What happens now?" Zara asked. "Judge Harmon's appointed a temporary town council of respected citizens," the marshal explained. "They'll oversee a special election next month. In the meantime, all water rights decisions are on hold until experts from the territorial capital can conduct an impartial assessment." Zara nodded, satisfied. "The small farms will survive then. Thanks to you, Miss Wilson." The marshal tipped his hat respectfully. After leaving the marshal's office, they made their way to Zara's small adobe house at the edge of town. It was a modest dwelling, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it was neat and well-maintained. "Home sweet home," Zara said with a touch of irony as she unlocked the door. "Though I haven't had much chance to miss it, given recent events." Inside, Blake looked around with interest at the simple furnishings. Bookshelves lined one wall, surprising him with their contents, volumes on law, history, and politics mixed with novels and poetry. "Quite a collection for a seamstress," he observed. "My father believed in education for all his children, daughters included," she explained, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "These were his. Reading them makes me feel closer to him." Blake nodded in understanding. "What will you do with the house when you come to Santa Fe?" Zara considered the question. "I'll sell it, I suppose. Use the money to establish myself there." She glanced around the small space that had been her sanctuary. "It holds memories, but not all of them good. Perhaps it's time for a fresh start. Speaking of which," Blake said, taking her hands in his, "I meant what I said about courting you properly. I'd like to take you to dinner tonight if you're amenable. The hotel dining room is surprisingly decent from what I recall." Zara smiled. "I'd like that." True to his word, Blake began a proper courtship. Each day for the next 2 weeks, as they tied up loose ends in Terlingua, he would call on Zara formally. They took rides into the surrounding countryside, dined together at the hotel, and spent evenings on her porch discussing books, ideas, and their plans for Santa Fe. Word spread quickly through town about their relationship. Some disapproved. A respectable federal investigator courting a troublemaking seamstress raised eyebrows, but many more approved, especially among the small farmers whose livelihoods had been saved by their actions. Mrs. Henderson, The baker's wife, who had always been kind to Zara, stopped her one morning as she was shopping for supplies. "I see that handsome investigator calling on you regular as clockwork," she said with a knowing smile. "Any wedding bells in your future, dear?" Zara blushed. "We're courting, Mrs. Henderson, taking our time to be sure." The older woman patted her hand. "Well, don't take too much time. A man who looks at a woman the way he looks at you doesn't come along every day." As their departure for Santa Fe drew nearer, Blake and Zara worked together to settle her affairs in Terlingua. She sold her small house to a young couple just arrived from the East, finding satisfaction in the wife's obvious delight with the bookshelves and cozy rooms. Her sewing business she transferred to her assistant, a widow with 3 children who had been learning the trade. The night before they were to leave, Blake took Zara to dinner at the hotel one last time. He seemed unusually nervous throughout the meal, his eyes frequently drifting to the pocket of his vest. After dessert, he cleared his throat. "Zara, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life," she smiled. "Mine too. I know we agreed to a proper courtship, and I respect that completely," he continued. "But before we leave for Santa Fe, I wanted to give you this." He withdrew a small box from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Zara looked at it with wide eyes. "It's not what you might think," Blake added quickly. "Or rather, not exactly." Curious, she opened the box to find a delicate silver ring set with a small sapphire that matched the color of her eyes. "It's a promise," Blake explained. "Not an engagement, not yet, but a promise of my intentions. A symbol that I am committed to our courtship, to earning your love and trust fully before asking for your hand." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes as she lifted the ring from its velvet cushion. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like the promise itself, it's meant to be worn if and when you feel ready," Blake said gently. "No pressure, no expectations." Zara studied the ring for a long moment, then looked up at Blake with a smile. "I think I'm ready now." She slipped the ring onto her finger. "A promise between equals." Blake's face lit with joy. "A promise between equals," he repeated, taking her hand across the table. They departed for Santa Fe the following morning, their belongings packed into a wagon Blake had purchased for the journey. The small farming community of Terlingua gathered to see them off, many expressing gratitude for their role in exposing the water rights corruption. As they drove away, Zara looked back at the town that had been her home for so long, the place where she had found her voice and learned the cost of using it. Then she turned to look forward, to the man beside her, and the future they would build together. The journey to Santa Fe took nearly 2 weeks, a time of transition and growing closeness. They passed through diverse landscapes, desert flats, mountain passes, verdant river valleys, each new vista a reminder of the adventure they had embarked upon together. They arrived in Santa Fe on a crisp autumn afternoon. The territorial capital was larger and more developed than Terlingua, with adobe buildings lining narrow streets that spoke of its Spanish heritage. Blake guided the wagon to a modest but well-maintained house on the outskirts of town. "The marshal's office arranged temporary housing for us," he explained as they pulled up to the property. "Separate accommodations, of course. You'll have the main house, and I'll stay in the guest quarters out back until our situation changes." Zara appreciated his continued respect for propriety, even as their feelings for each other deepened. The house was comfortable, with ample room for her books and belongings, and a small study that could serve as her workspace. The following day, Blake took her to meet Marshal Davis at the Federal Building downtown. The marshal was a gruff but fair-minded man who had worked with Judge Harmon for many years. "So you're the woman who stood up to Blackwell and his cronies," Davis said, appraising Zara with shrewd eyes. "Harmon speaks highly of you, Says you've got more courage than most men he knows. Thank you, sir, Zara replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Blake tells me you'll be working with him on investigations, Davis continued. Unusual arrangement, but these are unusual times. Territories changing fast, need all the good people we can get fighting corruption. He assigned them their first case, that very day suspected land fraud in a growing settlement north of Santa Fe. Over the following months, they established a routine, working together seamlessly as they investigated various cases of corruption throughout the territory. Blake kept his promise about Zara's education, spending evenings teaching her the finer points of territorial law. She proved an apt student, often grasping complex legal concepts more quickly than he expected. Within 6 months, her knowledge rivaled that of many practicing attorneys. Their courtship continued alongside their professional partnership. Blake took her to concerts and lectures in Santa Fe's growing cultural scene. They explored the surrounding countryside on weekend rides, discovering hidden valleys and ancient ruins together. Each evening ended with increasingly passionate embraces on her porch before Blake reluctantly retired to his separate quarters. As winter gave way to spring, Zara found herself falling deeper in love with Blake Lawson. It wasn't just his handsome face or his integrity that captivated her, but the way he consistently valued her mind and voice, the way he treated her as a true equal in all things. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Blake turned to her with unusual seriousness. "Zara, there's something I need to ask you." She recognized the tone in his voice and felt her heart quicken. "Yes." He took her hands in his. "These past months have been everything I hoped they would be. Working with you, courting you, watching you bloom into the force of nature I always knew you could be." He paused, searching her face. "I believe I've fulfilled my promise of a proper courtship." Zara smiled. "More than fulfilled it." Blake reached into his pocket and withdrew another small box, different from the one that had contained the promise ring she still wore. "Then, I have just one question." He opened the box to reveal a gold band set with a modest but brilliant diamond. "Zara Wilson, will you marry me? Be my partner in all things for all time." Tears of joy filled Zara's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated more strongly, "Yes, Blake Lawson, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger beside the promise ring, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that spoke of all the love and passion that had grown between them. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the territorial courthouse, with Judge Harmon presiding and Marshal Davis standing as Blake's witness. Mrs. Henderson had traveled all the way from Terlingua to support Zara, bringing with her letters and small gifts from the townspeople whose livelihoods had been saved by their actions. After the ceremony, Blake surprised Zara by taking her to a property on the outskirts of Santa Fe, a handsome adobe house with a spacious study, large enough for 2 desks side by side. "Our home," he said simply, watching her face as she explored the rooms. "If you approve." "It's perfect," she breathed, taking in the built-in bookshelves, the large windows that flooded the rooms with light, the comfortable furnishings that somehow combined his taste and hers seamlessly. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered a new dimension to their partnership, a physical passion that matched the intellectual and emotional connection they had already forged. In the years that followed, Blake and Zara Lawson became legendary throughout the New Mexico territory for their work exposing corruption and fighting for justice. They published articles in territorial newspapers about water rights, land fraud, and the importance of honest governance. Their investigations helped shape new laws protecting small landowners from powerful interests. 2 years after their marriage, Zara gave birth to their first child, a son they named James after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later. Both children grew up understanding the value of speaking truth to power, watching their parents work side by side as true partners. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, Governor William C. McDonald appointed Blake as the state's first attorney general, with Zara serving as special counsel, a position created specifically to utilize her unique expertise in land and water rights. On the evening of Blake's inauguration, as they stood on the balcony of the governor's mansion overlooking Santa Fe, he turned to his wife with the same admiration that had been in his eyes that first day in Terlingua. "Who would have thought," he mused, "that a troublemaking seamstress and a wandering investigator would end up here?" Zara smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I think you knew all along, from the moment you said my voice was what you'd been searching for." "The best decision I ever made was following that voice," Blake replied, kissing her tenderly. "It led me home." As the sun set over the city they had helped shape, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them here from the stocks in Terlingua to the highest legal office in the new state. Her voice, once punished, now helped write the very laws of the land. And beside her stood the man who had recognized its value from the beginning, who had never sought to silence but always to amplify. In the distance, church bells rang, and their children called for them from inside the mansion. Together, hand in hand, Blake and Zara turned to join the celebration, their partnership a testament to what could be accomplished when a woman's voice was not just heard but treasured.